Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning. And today my guest is John Macy, who is an Alexander Technique teacher of over 30 years experience and a physical therapist of almost 30 years experience who lives in Omaha, Nebraska. He is the owner of Ronin West PT, physical therapy, and the Workout Omaha, which is a Pilates studio. John is an Alexander teacher, a physical therapist, and also a Pilates instructor certified in mat work. And we're going to talk today about the Up with Gravity process, Alexander Technique negative directions, how to use them together, and in particular, how to simplify the process of using those two processes. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Robert. It's good to be here.
Well, it's good to talk to you, and I should say that John and I are colleagues that go way back, and he lives just up the road from me, really, in Omaha. And John and I have spent a lot of time working over the last few years, experimenting with and working with the Up with Gravity work and with negative directions, negative Alexander Technique directions, and with combining the two. And just recently, John's come up with a really interesting idea on how to make that combination even simpler and easier to use. So why don't we start with the basic ways of combining Up with Gravity and negative directions? And I'm going to assume that listeners are familiar with those processes. We'll put links to relevant information. The listeners are familiar with them sort of separately, but may not be familiar with the combining of the two. John, how would you, what do you see as the essence of combining those two processes?
I see the essence of it is really it's helping a person to figure out how to do things more easily. Mm-hmm. It's not, we all have essentially the same bodies, with the same control, very similar control systems. And so learning how to make things easier, there's several ways to get at it. Mm-hmm. But I see Alexander Technique, Up with Gravity, both work with how to change what we're thinking, to change our movement, to make our lives easier. And they're really the whole point of doing these things is to make what you do already easier, mm-hmm. which then makes it easier to do new things.
Exactly. And when we first started experimenting, we were using just plain old Up with Gravity, and that works pretty well. But what would you say is the main limitation of that on its own?
Well, I think the Up with Gravity is real useful at first to give you a means to provide for yourself a new movement experience. To look at something that you're doing and say, oh, this is how I could change it so my nervous system gets used to doing it differently. It knows what that experience is like. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing about the human nervous system is that when you repeat an activity, you really start changing the wiring. We can wire on the fly for new experiences. Mm-hmm. So Up with Gravity is great to do it, to give you that experience, start getting the wiring of moving in a new way that you created yourself. But after a while, it becomes a lot of work. It's only going to take you so far or require a lot more thinking and effort than you really need, because after the first few experiences, you've got the wiring in there started to make that easy for you. So you don't need to do all those procedures to try to get new wiring in because you're already laying it down. It's as if we already have made a few phone calls here, and by making the phone calls to that house, it installed more wiring. So I don't have to keep installing wiring. I don't have to do as much work the next time.
Right. And I think in terms of the pluses and minuses of Up with Gravity, the big plus is that pretty much anybody can learn how to do it in a few minutes with,
I think that,
either with some direct contact with the teacher teaching it, or simply by reading some of the material at the Up with Gravity site, it is incredibly simple to deploy and can make pretty dramatic changes in your functioning.
I agree. I think that's one of its great beauties is it's so easy for somebody to do. To say, I just had to do this little thing, and I realized that it made a lot of other things I did easier right now, and I did it for myself. And that's very empowering for people to know that I don't have to have a big fancy course or a bunch of teachers or spend a lot of time. I can help myself real quickly.
And you can then use it whenever you want during the day. It's a pretty easy process to use. But as you point out, John, there is a little downside to it, which is that certainly the lifting component, when you're actually lifting your center of gravity, does require a little work.
It requires a little work, and let's face it, it's a mechanical phenomenon. You can only get your center so high.
Exactly.
So once you're there, doing a lot of work to try to raise it up is really wasting your energy because it's not going to go. It's as high as you're going to get it or as high as you're going to need it for the activity you're doing.
Right.
And this is where I think people can get kind of stuck because they keep trying to go higher and higher because they want the same experience. And after you're used to doing it, you don't need to do that.
Absolutely. And the other downside, if you want to call it that, is that when you're lifting your center of gravity, you're doing that lifting in the context of the state of your coordination at that time. And it's quite possible that that lifting may not be, let's say, 100% accurate in terms of your structure and how gravity's working on you. It might be 90 or 95% accurate. And it would be nice if there were a way to bridge that last little gap in accuracy.
Yes, and I think one of the ways people are not accurate is they literally overshoot it. Mm-hmm. They come up and they go up a little too high, and then they're very stiff to try to keep it up there. But in reality, they're just a little too high, and they're working too hard to keep it up too high.
They're doing a little bit of end gaining in Alexander jargon, wouldn't you say? So for my money, the first and easiest way to bridge that accuracy gap is to combine Up with Gravity with Alexander Technique negative directions. And for those listeners who are not familiar with negative directions and how they can be used and what their advantages are, I'll put a link to a page that has information on that. But when you combine Up with Gravity with negative directions, then you really get a pretty accurate change in how you're functioning.
Yeah, I don't know if accurate is correct.
Accurate's not the right word.
You get a much more successful outcome.
Closer to optimal. How's that, John?
Yeah, I think that's
closer. Yeah, accurate's not the best.
Optimal is one of my favorite words when talking about movement.
Well, there you go.
Because really it incorporates what is it that you want to do. And using the Up with Gravity and the negative directions for myself and for my students appears to get them a lot closer to having the quality and ease of movement that they desire in the actual functional activity they want to engage in.
Right.
It hits the target better.
Exactly. Now, that all sounds good as far as it goes, but when you're
it didn't go far enough?
Well, you got to start considering the question of how many new thoughts you can have consciously in your brain at any one time. There's a lot of research that suggests that most of us can only manage 7 plus or minus 2 ideas at any one moment. And whether that's the exact number and whether all ideas are equal is hard to say, but there's definitely a limitation. And when one of the geniuses of F. Matthias Alexander, the developer of the Alexander Technique, was choosing a really good intervention point. In his case, the neck or head-neck torso relationship. You going after one intervention point had a lot of a lot of benefits throughout the whole body. And I would argue that your center of gravity and manipulating that's a pretty powerful intervention point as well, equally, maybe even more so.
Well, it's
but certainly in the same range of usefulness, right?
Yes, and I think the other thing is not only did F. Mathias figure out there was a place to intervene, but a time to intervene.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
When you had the idea for a volitional movement, you want to insert this little change right at the beginning, and then you got on with the movement. You didn't stop just because you were inserting this little piece.
Right.
And I think that's a critical aspect to understand, that it's about changing that whole flow, but you don't eliminate the flow. You get on with the activity you intend to do.
Right. And I know where you're headed on this, but I'd like to back up a second to the intervention, the number of interventions that you can do at one time. So combining up with gravity with negative directions is going to involve two separate interventions. There may be related, but there are two of them.
Mm-hmm.
And two new thoughts is a lot harder to keep going than twice one new thought. It's probably, exponential in some way. So that leads to the strategies that are available for combining them. And strategy number one, which I think is really good for new people that are just starting to experiment with it, is to do some lifting of your center of gravity and then briefly overlap that new lifted self with the I'm not compressing myself or something like that kind of negative directions, and let go gently of the lifting so that you're left with just one intervention. That is, I'm not compressing myself. And then you can go back and lift your center a little more and do that overlap again. And you could kind of pump yourself up that way very effectively. The key there, I think, is that the time during which those two thoughts are going at the same time is very short.
Yes,
makes it easier to do that. And then the second strategy is to, once you become familiar with that, is to combine the two almost as though they were one, so that you could say, I'm not compressing myself as I lift my center of gravity. Or you could alternate. There are ways around this plus or minus 7 limitation.
Yes, and it really depends on how an individual thinks. Try them all out and see which one works for you at the time that you're doing it.
And what might work for you today, there might be something better that would work for you in a couple of days or a week. Because when you start using these techniques, negative directing and negative directions and up with gravity, there comes a point where your body-mind just the tiniest little thought of one of them, it says, oh, I know about that. I don't need a lot of detailed, I can just go right into it.
Yeah, you've laid all those pathways in, you practice it enough, so as soon as you cue it at any type or from any direction, I think your nervous system just runs the program for the whole thing.
Exactly.
And so it takes less and less effort on your part. And as we've discovered in playing with this over the last several years, the language you have to talk to yourself with changes every time.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
And I think that's a function of what kind of wiring have you laid into your nervous system to figure out how to do this.
Exactly. So one way or another, combining negative directions with up with gravity is, I think, a huge jump forward in not just the optimality, if that's a word, of what you're doing, but also it is there's a lot less you have to do.
I like that idea.
Which is always a good thing. And the intensity of what you're doing or thinking, really, at that point, becomes less. It's just easier to do.
It's easier, and I find with myself and with students that they don't get stiff and very hung up on how it feels. When they
Yes.
use the phrase, I'm not compressing, that's such a nice, soft, generalized phrase that it just keeps them from doing a lot of the bad stiffening, tightening, getting stuck, am I doing it right kind of
Hmm.
questions that so many of us ask ourselves when we're doing something new.
Yeah, I mean, when I tell people, well, here's an example of a negative direction that I like a lot, which is I'm not compressing myself, which of course is very general. That's a tough one to mess up for most people, and because it's so uh, you'd hardly know how to mess it up. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? And that's one of its huge advantages. And as I point out to people, you don't have to understand what that means, and you certainly don't have to have any idea of how your body is going to take that information. That's not your job. Your job is to deliver the intent and let your
yeah, your,
physical mechanism get on with it.
yeah. Your conscious mind just has to deliver the message, and you're wired to some degree to handle the rest of it.
Exactly.
Your
N-
conscious mind is just the messenger.
Now, in line with this general idea of less work, less mental, less physical work, more effective outcome, in the last couple of weeks, no more than that, maybe a month or two, when we've been experimenting, you've come up with an interesting variant that applies to this combining of negative directions and up with gravity, but would also apply to any Alexander direction. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yes, I've been working a lot with the temporal, the time component of this.
Hmm.
And instead of spending a lot of time thinking about it, to get moving and just get on with what you're doing. Make it very quick. It's not, well, I'm going to move my center of gravity up. Now I'm going to not compress and not compress and not compress, and I'm going to start to walk and not compress.
Hmm.
But more along the line of my center of gravity is going up. I'm not going to compress. Let's get walking. Wow, look what's down the street. Making it much quicker and taking a lot less time, but inserting it, as I said earlier, and like Alexander found, inserting it right at the beginning. So any activity you do gets wired with doing this as a part of the activity.
And just so our listeners can be really clear what this process or this variant on a process is, let's say that you're doing a little lifting of your center of gravity, you're overlapping it with I'm not compressing myself, you let go of the lifting, you notice a little change within yourself, then you just go right into whatever you're going to do, whether it's getting out of a chair or walking or chopping vegetables, and you don't necessarily come back to those ideas.
That's correct.
So
To
you're
take it,
just walking with this new
yeah,
internal coordination that you've brought about for yourself, which
and a
may
new,
not last forever. Maybe it'll only last 30 seconds, right?
right, but you've done it as including it as the first thing I do.
The first
So you
thing you
just start
do,
off that way. So
right?
now walking isn't a separate activity. The coming up in the center of gravity and not compressing is a part of that activity right at the beginning. It's all
Exactly.
wired as a piece, as a continuum, instead of a separation between them.
And the way I've been working with this just in the last few weeks with my students is I get them started exactly the way you described, and then and I say, at some point it might hit you that you're kind of getting a little clunky in your walk or your breathing's a little restricted, you've gone back to your old ways. There's no reason on earth why you can't bring that same intent to bear again. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like you only get one shot at it, you know.
Yeah,
But I think the essential thing is that it's not something that you continue throughout the activity, which I think could be a good strategy for newcomers who are first kind of getting their wiring redone. But I think once you get to a point where you can make a change and it's stable, even if it's only stable for 20 seconds, why clutter it with extra stuff? Why not just get on with your life?
yes, and then you don't have to carry all those extra thoughts around, which take up neural space. You only have so much processing ability.
They take up neural space, and they make it more likely that you're going to stiffen up around them a little bit or try to be right or something like that.
I think that's a good point, that it really helps prevent you from trying to be right. And instead you can ask yourself, was that a little easier? Okay, then you're good.
Exactly.
That's what you were after.
And trying to be right is like a classic trap in the Alexander technique.
Oh, in so much of the world.
I don't think there's any Alexander teacher in the world who hasn't had to deal with that in their students, and I would say in themselves. I catch myself trying to be right, and I've been at this for even about the same length of time you have,
30 years, eh?
A little more.
Yeah.
So it is a way of getting around some of the classic problems. I mean, all of this is kind of there's no rigid formula for any of this. It's all going to differ from person to person, and different times. At different times, you'll want to use different strategies. There's an art to it, and the only way to develop your ability in that art is to practice it. There really is no other way that I know of.
And I think it also points up the beauty of one of the things Alexander discovered, which was we have the mechanisms to change and refine and improve our response to stimuli and our ability to move. Mm-hmm. We can self-correct. We've evolved to have self-correcting mechanisms, and there's a number of ways for us to get those kicked on, and this is one of them. When you use this up with gravity in the negative directions, you still make your life a little bit easier, and you can do it for yourself.
Exactly. These are very much self-help processes that I think actually both of them and the combination of the two can be learned by an awful lot of people without any direct contact with a teacher. I do think having some contact with the teacher can be very useful, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary.
Well, I tell my students that they aren't learning anything that they couldn't figure out for themselves. A teacher just makes it happen faster.
Yeah, I think
because
that's
I've sorted
exactly
some of those things out, and I can help them have sensory experiences to get their nervous system to realize this is possible. And that's the big thing. If you don't think it's possible, you aren't going to do it.
Which
but as soon as you think it's possible,
yes,
you do it.
Exactly. And that's why I think good teaching, Alexander teaching of any kind, gives students the experience of something that they might not quite be able to get on their own at the beginning, but they get that it is compatible with their current physical structure, so to speak. Mm-hmm. They get a glimpse of what's possible, and that's very very empowering. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, John, is there anything you want to add to our discussion?
No, I think we've pretty well covered it. I think
right.
These ideas are very interesting and useful, and I've been using them for the last however many months we've been working with this material, and I'm seeing my students grasp these principles so much faster than I have in the past. I think it's really conveying a tremendous amount of information and ability to explore for my students.
Exactly. So, my guest today has been John Macy, who is an Alexander Technique teacher, a physical therapist, and a Pilates mat work instructor in Omaha, Nebraska. If you live in Omaha and anything we've talked about interests you, give him a call. We'll put a link to his contact information by the interview. If you live anywhere else in the world, we'll put a link to a site that will enable you to find an Alexander teacher where you are. Also, we'll include a link to the Up With Gravity page that has information on how to learn on your own these. Both certainly the Up With Gravity process, and quite a bit of information about negative directions and how to learn to start applying those in your life as well. John, thanks so much for being on the show.
It's been my pleasure, Robert.